Hello, this is the 280th edition of Catch of the Day, available on the Branch Talk YouTube channel. Today we're going to continue reading from a book written by Trent Wildy entitled The King of Crisis in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Starting on page 37, about halfway into the first paragraph, we read, "The lion's mouth that would rip them to pieces is now the words of God's mouth spoken by the prophets, hacking and destroying Israel and Judah." 6:5. Why does he do this? Because he does not want the sacrifices by which they seek him. 5:6 and 6:6. He wants them to truly know him. Chapter 6, verse 6. The fact that God's desire for Israel and Judah to have a knowledge of him is given as an explanation as to why he sent his prophets to bring judgment upon them shows that God's appointed means of imparting that knowledge is indeed the prophets. This precisely matches and clearly expresses what we have already found to be one of the core principles of Hosea's message, and this point will only shine out more brightly as we continue. The rest of Hosea 6 emphasizes the truth developed in 5 verse 14 to 6 verse 6 by pointing again to the sin of Israel, and especially to the priests, who are compared to robbers, an image later picked up by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 7. Hosea 7. The rebuke of the sins of Israel continues into chapter 7, and once again the house of the king is brought under sharp scrutiny. By their wickedness they make the king glad, and the officials by their treachery. Hosea 7 verse 3, NRSV. By saying that the king is happy about all the wickedness of Israel, Hosea was declaring that the king shared in all their guilt. The king and the officials were corrupt. From Hosea's perspective, this wasn't a matter of one unusually wicked king. The problem was systemic. He pointed to what must have been a well-known and scandalous fact that conspiracy was rife within the ruling class of Israel. 7 verse 4 to 7. In fact, out of the 5 kings who ruled Israel after the end of the Jehu dynasty, 4 of them gained rulership by assassinating the previous king. 2 Kings 15 verse 8 to 31. As this was happening, Hosea bore the message of God. And all of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen. None of them calls upon me. Hosea 7 verse 7, NRSV. The rest of the chapter is taken up by further rebuking their sins and warning them of the futility of seeking aid from foreign nations. Their end was nigh. Hosea 8. In the midst of all this wickedness, one would think that Israel would be full of shame, but instead they tried to reassure God. Israel cries to me, "My God, we, Israel, know you." Hosea 8, verse 2, NRSV. Do you think God was comforted? Hosea knew that God wasn't, and he knew that Israel was in a sad state of self-deception. The word of God through Hosea was, "Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but without my knowledge. They have gone up to Assyria, a wild ass wandering alone. Ephraim has bargained for lovers. Though they bargain with the nations, I will now gather them up. They shall soon writhe under the burden of kings and princes. Hosea 8, verse 3 and 4a, 9 and 10, NRSV. Israel may have thought that it was God who established their kings, but God declared through Hosea that he had nothing to do with it. Through her kings, 2 Kings 15, verse 19 and 20, and 17, verse 3, Israel went seeking after other nations and their gods, the lovers. The line of reasoning culminating in verse 10 is something like this. Israel, you think you know me, but you don't. You think I set up your kings, but I didn't. You set them up independent of me. The attempt by your kings to make friends with the other nations will only result in you be subjugated under them. Since you love having kings so much, I'll give you kings, but they will be the kings of the nations under whose burden you will soon writhe. Israel thought they were good with God through their monarch system, but also through their priestly system. In the first section of this chapter, God says he rejected Israel's kings, and they would therefore be scattered to the nations. In the second part of the chapter, God says he rejected their sacrifices, and so they would be scattered to the nations. Hosea 9. Do not rejoice, O Israel. Do not exult as other nations do, for you have played the whore, departing from your God. You have loved a prostitute's pay on all threshing floors. They shall not remain in the land of Israel, or the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and in Assyria they shall eat unclean food. Hosea 9, verse 1 and 3, NRSV. Israel's sin was so great that exile was the only solution. God knew that they would continue in their perverse priestly practices, but if they did it among the nations, they would at least not be doing it in his honor. Chapter 9, verse 4 and 5. As I'm sure you can see by now, Hosea's message was intensely radical. It undermined both the monarch system and the priestly structures, which were the foundational structures of the nation of Israel. What was their response to Hosea and his message? Israel cries, the prophet is a fool. The man of the spirit is mad. Hosea 9, verse 7b, NRSV. It is easy for us to look back and think, wow, Israel was so stubborn and hard of hearing. They had a prophet right in the midst speaking to them the word of God, and yet they rejected him. How could they call God's prophet a fool and a madman? But in all seriousness, if we had a prophet alive among us today declaring that we have been establishing our leaders independent of God, and that God rejects our governmental and religious structures, insisting that those structures need to come to an end and that we need to be led by God through prophets, how do you think we would respond? Do you think we would accept such a prophet and such a message? This is a question worth pondering in self-examination. Take care.